My sister stole my system access and walked into a federal boardroom with 7 strategic lies under her name. She just didn't know they were lies. I was sitting in the second row at Vanguard Defense Systems, hands folded on a legal pad, watching Paige stand at the front of the room like she owned it. $40 million engagement. 2 retired flag officers on the advisory panel. Chief Compliance Officer with 25 years in federal procurement. The kind of room where people don't clap for buzzwords. Paige clicked to slide 5. Confident, polished, calm. She had always been good in rooms like this. The positioning framework appeared on the screen. Clean design. Tight language. Strong narrative arc. Wrong market tier. Not wildly wrong. Not cartoonishly stupid. Just wrong enough that anyone who actually understood federal contracting would feel the shift in the air. I didn't move. 6 months earlier, I had been assigned to Ironclad Advisory through an Army Cyber Industry Exchange program. I'm a major in U.S. Army Cyber stationed out of Fort Belvoir. 14 years in uniform, 2 deployments, clearance paperwork that's thicker than most people's mortgage files. My role at Ironclad wasn't sales. It wasn't PR. It wasn't innovation. It was compliance, alignment, risk modeling, and making sure nobody accidentally violated federal acquisition regulations while trying to look creative. In plain English, I keep people from doing dumb things that cost contracts. Vanguard Defense Systems had hired Ironclad to restructure how they positioned several sensitive programs. That meant every word, every vendor, every cost structure had to align with DFARS requirements. Controlled unclassified information handling and supply chain risk controls. It was the kind of project that punishes ego. Paige joined Ironclad 3 weeks after I did. 33 years old. MBA. Charismatic. Fast talker. She could walk into a networking event and leave with 3 new contacts and a dinner invitation. Growing up, she was the one teachers loved. I was the one who read policy manuals for fun. Ironclad leadership loved her immediately. Director of Client Engagement. Front-facing role. She'd handle executive presentations. I'd support the strategy. That word. Support. I didn't mind the structure. In the Army, rank is clear. Authority is defined. At Ironclad, authority floated toward whoever spoke the most confidently in a meeting. Over the first month, a pattern formed. I built the compliance matrix. Paige summarized it in meetings. I drafted the vendor vetting framework. Paige presented it as a streamlined engagement model. Emails would land in her inbox from Vanguard. They'd land in mine 30 seconds later with 2 words above them. Handle this. I handled everything. Risk flags, vendor background checks, pricing alignment with federal contracting norms. I documented every revision, every approval, every version change. That habit isn't paranoia, it's training. In the Army, documentation protects careers. In federal contracting, it protects companies. Then came the week before the board strategy session. Paige told the executive team she needed full access to the project strategy folder to finalize the presentation deck. She framed it as efficiency. No bottlenecks. No last-minute confusion. I declined sharing credentials. Ironclad had a shared drive with role-based permissions for a reason. We were handling sensitive material. The next morning, IT notified me that temporary elevated access had been granted to Paige per leadership approval. The approval email was real. The sender, however, was not. Someone had created an internal-looking address that mirrored a senior partner's name closely enough to slip through if you didn't look carefully. IT saw approved and processed the request. I checked the system logs that afternoon, 9:42 p.m. Access granted. Bulk file download initiated. 7 strategy documents opened. 3 renamed. I stared at the timestamps for a long time. Paige didn't call me. She didn't text me. She didn't ask. She just took it. I didn't escalate immediately. Not because I was unsure. Because escalation without preparation is just noise. Instead, I reviewed what she had downloaded. 7 working draft strategy files I had built over the prior week. Clean layouts, structured analysis, early-stage positioning frameworks. Each one still marked internally as draft. Each one not ready for client presentation. Some had market segmentation that needed refinement. One had a vendor shortlist that required additional clearance verification. Another had a cost model built for scenario testing, not final pricing. They weren't disasters, they were unfinished. There's a difference. At 11:03 p.m., the logs showed export activity again. The next morning, Paige walked into the office energized. She didn't mention the access change. She didn't mention the downloads. Instead, she told leadership she had worked late refining the strategic direction and was excited to present something bold to Vanguard's board. Bold. I updated my own restricted folder that afternoon. Cleaned up the finalized compliance crosswalk. Locked the vendor vetting analysis with sourcing citations. Finalized the risk mitigation matrix aligned to DFARS clauses. Saved everything under a limited permission directory. Then I archived a copy to the Army-approved external drive I use for documentation during industry assignments. Not dramatic, just organized. 48 hours before the board session, Paige emailed Vanguard the final strategic deck. I didn't receive a review request. I didn't receive a copy. I saw the email through internal routing logs. Attachment name, Vanguard_strategy_final.pptx. The file size matched the 7 drafts almost exactly. At that point, it wasn't confusion. It was intent. The morning of the board meeting, I notified my direct Army supervisor of the access irregularity and documented the timeline. No accusations, just facts. That protects my clearance and ensures transparency. Then I put on my uniform-adjacent civilian suit and drove to Vanguard headquarters. Back in the boardroom, Paige clicked to slide 6, messaging framework. A subtle shift in language that suggested broader public-facing positioning than Vanguard's program scope allowed. The chief compliance officer leaned forward slightly. Not angry, just focused. Slide 7 loaded. Vendor alignment model. One of the vendors on that list hadn't completed updated supply chain risk certification. I knew because I had flagged it 2 days earlier in the real file. Paige kept going. Her tone didn't change. Her posture didn't change. She believed this was her moment. I remained in the second row, pen resting on the paper, watching the room begin to calculate. Not explode, not panic. Calculate. And that's when the first real question landed across the table. The chief compliance officer didn't raise his voice when he asked it. He just looked at Paige and said, "Can you walk us through how this positioning aligns with controlled information handling requirements?" Paige smiled like she'd been waiting for that. Confident, relaxed, comfortable. That expression wasn't new to me. I'd seen it my entire life. Paige has always been the one who performs well under a spotlight. Growing up in Northern Virginia, she could talk her way out of grounding talk teachers into deadline extensions, talk neighbors into believing the dog really did open the gate by itself. I was the one who followed instructions. She was the one who negotiated them. At family gatherings, relatives asked Paige about internships and social life. They asked me if I was still doing that Army thing. When I commissioned after ROTC, my parents were proud. But when Paige landed a marketing internship in D.C., they threw a party. It wasn't malicious, it was tone. She was exciting. I was stable. She was bold. I was rigid. By the time I deployed for the first time, Paige had already learned how to leverage my career socially. My sister's in military cyber, she'd say at events. I basically grew up around national security. She'd say it like proximity equaled expertise. The first time I noticed her using my title professionally, I let it go. It felt harmless. Just family pride stretched a little too far. Over time, the pattern sharpened. She referenced my clearance level to impress people. She hinted she understood classified contracting processes because she heard about it at home. We did not discuss classified work at home. I corrected her once quietly. She brushed it off, said I was being too sensitive. Our parents sided with her. She's just networking. Don't make it a big deal. So I stopped making it a big deal. Until it started happening at Ironclad. The day Paige joined the firm, she texted me before her first internal meeting. "Let's not tell everyone we're sisters yet. I want to establish myself on my own." That lasted 4 days. By the end of the first week, she had mentioned it in at least 2 client-facing conversations. Framed it as an advantage. Access, insight. Leadership didn't question it. In fact, they liked the narrative. Military insider plus charismatic strategist. It looked good on paper. What they didn't see was how the work actually moved. When Vanguard sent a 60-page compliance questionnaire, it landed in Paige's inbox. She forwarded it to me in under a minute. Handle this. No context, no notes, just expectation. I completed the entire crosswalk, aligned each question to DFARS clauses, flagged 3 vendor exposure risks, and attached supporting documentation. In the next internal strategy call, Paige summarized it as a clean compliance alignment I developed after reviewing their structure. No correction from leadership, no pause, just nods. After that, it became routine. Vendor due diligence. Handle this. Pricing variance analysis. Handle this. Risk modeling for controlled data flow. Handle this. She never said it harshly. That was part of the skill. It always sounded collaborative. You're better at this back-end structure stuff. You think in frameworks. You're more detail-oriented. It was framed as compliment. In the Army, we call that misdirection. What made it harder was that some part of her believed it. Paige doesn't think she steals credit. She thinks she elevates work by presenting it better. That belief is dangerous. 2 weeks before the board meeting, we had an internal review session with Ironclad's senior partners. I walked through a preliminary market segmentation model, highlighting limitations in expanding beyond tightly controlled federal segments. One partner nodded. Paige jumped in. What Maddie means, she said, is that there's an opportunity to push into adjacent commercial sectors with the right messaging guardrails. That wasn't what I meant. Not even close, I clarified. Calmly. Explained the regulatory constraints. Referenced the specific acquisition pathways Vanguard operated under. The room grew quieter. Paige held her ground. Innovation requires testing assumptions. Leadership smiled at that line. Testing assumptions sounds visionary, saying DFARS Clause 252.204-7012 restricts that approach does not. After the meeting, she told me I was being too conservative. You think like the Army, she said. We're in consulting now. I didn't respond emotionally. I pulled up the actual contract structure Vanguard operated under and showed her why the segmentation mattered. She skimmed it, said she trusted my technical depth but believed she could package it differently. Package. That word kept coming up. The difference between us has never been intelligence. It's appetite for risk. In uniform, unmanaged risk gets people hurt. In federal contracting, unmanaged risk gets companies audited. Paige thrives in gray areas. I eliminate them. The week before she requested system access, she started spending more time in executive meetings without me. She'd loop me in afterward with summaries that were just vague enough to make follow-up difficult. She also began introducing new language into decks that I hadn't drafted. Subtle shifts, broader audience references, looser phrasing around controlled programs. Nothing catastrophic, just directional drift. I flagged it privately. She assured me it was positioning nuance. Then came the access request. It wasn't framed as overreach. It was framed as necessity. You're stretched thin, she said. Let me help. Help doesn't require bypassing protocol. When the IT notification hit my inbox, confirming her elevated permissions, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, recognition. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about control. Back in the boardroom, Paige was still speaking. The compliance officer waited for her explanation on how public-facing language would be reconciled with controlled program requirements. She responded with a smooth reference to adaptive transparency within regulatory boundaries. That phrase didn't exist in any acquisition manual I've ever read. The CFO glanced at the vendor slide. One finger tapped lightly on the table. Paige continued, unaware that the room had shifted from listening to measuring. I watched her pace. I watched the slight tightening around her jaw. She thought she was steering. She didn't realize the current had already changed. The CFO stopped tapping his pen and leaned back, eyes still on the vendor slide. Paige kept talking. She moved to the next section like nothing had shifted. Budget allocation framework. Clean charts. Projected efficiencies. Executive-friendly language. That part looked sharp because I built the underlying model. What she didn't fully understand was the difference between a modeling scenario and a finalized recommendation. The file she downloaded had 3 budget scenarios. 1 conservative, 1 compliant, 1 exploratory. She was presenting the exploratory version. Inside Ironclad, the pattern had been building long before this room. The phrase "handle this" started showing up more often the closer we got to the Vanguard board session. It came at 7:12 a.m. on a Monday when Vanguard's security office asked for clarification on subcontractor background checks. It came at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday, when the pricing team questioned whether our cost structure aligned with cost-plus contract norms. It came without punctuation, without explanation. Handle this. I handled everything. Vendor clearance verification meant cross-checking against the system for award management database and reviewing updated supply chain risk attestations. It meant confirming there were no foreign ownership flags that could trigger review under Committee on Foreign Investment Regulations. Pricing alignment meant restructuring the cost model to reflect federal indirect rate expectations instead of commercial margin assumptions. Risk modeling meant mapping out downstream exposure if messaging language drifted beyond what program classification allowed. Every time I sent back a revised document, I embedded citations, clause references, version notes. Paige stripped most of that out in the executive decks. Too dense, she said once. They don't need the weeds. In federal contracting, the weeds are the contract. 2 weeks before the board meeting, Ironclad hosted a prep session with senior partners to rehearse the Vanguard strategy. I walked through the compliance matrix first. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. It showed exactly how each strategic recommendation aligned with applicable regulations. One partner nodded and asked if it could be simplified for the board. Paige stepped in smoothly. "We can distill this into a more visionary framework," she said. "Focus less on constraints and more on opportunity." That word again, opportunity. I clarified that constraints define opportunity in federal environments. If you don't respect them, you don't have an opportunity. You have exposure. She countered with language about evolving procurement culture. The room split its attention between us. Not hostile, curious. Afterward, one of the partners pulled me aside and said, "You're right on the compliance, Maddie. Just try to let Paige own the narrative." Own the narrative. That's how it works in consulting. Whoever controls the room controls perception. I wasn't trying to control the room. I was trying to prevent a preventable mistake. 3 days before the system access incident, Vanguard sent over a follow-up request about vendor partnerships. They specifically asked whether all recommended vendors met updated CMMC readiness thresholds. The vendor on Paige's preferred list had not completed its updated readiness certification. I flagged it in the internal working draft. Bright yellow highlight. Pending verification, do not present as finalized. That was in one of the 7 files she downloaded. The day after she gained access, I noticed subtle edits in the shared folder. My initials removed from file names. Draft deleted from titles. She was cleaning them up, not refining content, repackaging it. In the office kitchen that afternoon, she mentioned how exciting it was to finally put her own stamp on the Vanguard engagement. "Your structure was great," she said casually. "It just needed stronger framing." Stronger framing doesn't change vendor certification status. That night, after confirming through system logs that she had exported the files, I reviewed each document she accessed. The exploratory budget model was there. The broader segmentation language was there. The vendor list without updated compliance notes was there. None of it was catastrophic alone. Combined, it created a narrative that leaned aggressively into growth while downplaying regulatory gravity. That kind of imbalance is exactly what federal boards test for. The following morning, she scheduled a closed-door prep with Ironclad leadership to walk through what she called her revised strategic direction. I wasn't invited. An hour later, one of the junior analysts forwarded me a message. "Deck looks strong. Paige says we're pushing boundaries in a smart way." Boundaries are not decorative lines in federal work. They are structural. At that point, I had 2 options. Escalate internally before the board meeting and accuse my own sister of misrepresenting draft work, or document everything, finalize the compliance strategy in parallel, and allow the board to evaluate what was put in front of them. Escalation without full context can look personal. Documentation speaks for itself. Back in the Vanguard boardroom, Paige clicked to the pricing slide. She described the cost model as a flexible structure designed to maximize scalability across program tiers. That wasn't how the file described it. The exploratory scenario assumed commercial-style margin flexibility. Federal cost-plus structures don't operate that way. The CFO leaned forward again. "Can you clarify how this aligns with federal cost accounting standards?" Paige paused for half a second, not long enough for most people to notice. Long enough for me to. She pivoted to generalities about adaptability and financial efficiency. The CFO didn't interrupt. He wrote something down. Across the table, the chief compliance officer flipped back 2 slides on his printed copy. The room wasn't hostile. It was analytical. That's worse. Analytical rooms don't explode. They dissect. And Paige was still speaking as if the floor belonged to her. The chief compliance officer closed his folder slowly and looked back at Paige instead of the screen. Before we move on, he said calm and steady, "I want to understand how this vendor list was cleared." Paige didn't hesitate. "We ran a full internal review," she replied. "Everything aligns with current federal requirements." That statement carried weight. It also wasn't accurate. 2 nights before this meeting, I had been sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open when the IT notification came through. Temporary elevated access granted. User Paige Shaw. Scope Full Strategy Directory. Duration 72 hours. The approval chain referenced a senior partner at Ironclad. Something about it didn't feel right. I forwarded the notification to our internal IT contact and asked for confirmation. He replied within minutes. "Came through from leadership. All good." It wasn't all good. I opened the email approval attached to the ticket. The display name matched the partner's name exactly. The email address did not. 1 character was off. Close enough to pass a glance. Not close enough to survive a review. I didn't call Paige that night. I logged into the system and checked the activity feed instead. 9:42 p.m. Elevated access initiated. 9:44 p.m. Vanguard. _segmentation_draft opened. 9:47 p.m. Vanguard_vendor_model_draft opened. 9:49 p.m. Vanguard_pricing_scenarios opened. 9:55 p.m. Bulk download initiated. She didn't browse. She targeted. By 10:08 p.m., the files had been exported. At 10:17 p.m., 3 of the same file names appeared again, re-uploaded with cleaner titles. No draft label. No internal notes. I leaned back and let the pattern settle in. She hadn't stumbled into access. She had engineered it. The next morning, I confirmed with the actual senior partner that he had not authorized expanded permissions. He hadn't. IT revoked Paige's elevated access quietly once the discrepancy was identified. No announcement. No escalation yet. I had a choice. I could push for immediate disciplinary action, or I could assess what she intended to do with the files first. I chose to assess. Inside the shared directory, I opened the re-uploaded versions she had created. She had adjusted slide headers, reworded positioning language to sound more aggressive, removed yellow highlighted compliance notes, deleted a footnote that referenced pending vendor certification. What she didn't change were the underlying assumptions embedded in the models, because she didn't fully understand them. The segmentation draft she downloaded included a placeholder tier labeled Adjacent Commercial Stakeholders. That placeholder was there for discussion, not adoption. It existed to illustrate why certain segments were off-limits under Vanguard's current contract structure. She kept the tier. The vendor model included a short list flagged for secondary clearance review. She removed the flag. The pricing scenarios included 3 tabs. Conservative, compliant, exploratory. She based her deck on exploratory. None of these were criminal acts by themselves. They were judgment calls. But they were judgment calls made without full knowledge of federal contracting risk. That's where problems start. That afternoon, Paige acted like nothing had happened. She walked into my office and leaned against the doorframe. "I pulled the strategy files last night," she said casually. "I didn't want to bottleneck us." "You didn't want to ask." That was the part she left out. "You had access approved?" I asked evenly. "Leadership's on board," she replied. "We can't keep operating in silos." That word again. Silos. I nodded. "Just make sure you're working from the most current assumptions." She smiled. "Trust me." Trust isn't a compliance control. After she left, I exported the system activity logs to a secure folder and annotated them with timestamps. I documented the email discrepancy. I saved the original draft versions with metadata intact. Then I did something that mattered more than anything else. I finished the real strategy. The compliant segmentation framework tightened to align precisely with Vanguard's contract categories. The vendor list scrubbed and cross-checked against updated CMMC status. The pricing model recalibrated to reflect federal cost structures with clear audit trails. The compliance matrix cross-referenced line by line with applicable DFARS clauses. I locked that version under restricted access. I also notified my Army supervisor that there had been an internal access irregularity at the partner firm. No accusations, just facts and documentation. That protects my clearance and ensures transparency if questions ever arise. 2 days later, Paige emailed the finalized board deck to Vanguard. Subject line: Vanguard Strategic Alignment. Final presentation. I wasn't copied, but the file size matched the drafts she had exported. The board session was scheduled for Tuesday at 900. Ironclad leadership held a brief internal prep call Monday afternoon. Paige presented highlights from the deck. Big picture language. Growth narrative. Confident tone. No one asked to see the underlying compliance crosswalk. No one asked whether vendor certifications had been verified. The room liked momentum. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from our mother. Heard you and Paige are working together. Don't be so hard on her. This is important for her. I stared at the message for a few seconds. Important for her. Not important for the client. Not important for regulatory compliance. Important for her. Back in the Vanguard boardroom, the chief compliance officer waited for Paige to answer his question about vendor clearance verification. She repeated that internal review had confirmed alignment. I wrote down the time on my notepad. The CFO flipped to the appendix of the printed deck. One of the retired officers on the advisory panel cleared his throat quietly. Paige moved to the next slide as if momentum would carry her through. It didn't. The room had stopped moving with her. It was starting to move around her instead. The retired Navy officer at the far end of the table adjusted his glasses and asked Paige to pull the segmentation slide back up. She clicked backward as steady hand controlled breathing. From where I sat, I could see the fine print at the bottom of the slide, the part she had trimmed down but not fully removed. Adjacent commercial stakeholders. That tier had never been intended as a recommendation. It was a stress test category I built into the early draft to demonstrate exposure risk if Vanguard expanded messaging beyond strictly controlled federal channels. She had framed it as opportunity. That shift didn't happen by accident. It happened because she didn't understand the risk profile behind it. When I realized she had accessed and reworked those files, I didn't create something explosive. I created something precise. 7 draft frameworks, each one professional on the surface. Each one containing a pressure point that only mattered if someone tried to present it as finalized strategy. The segmentation model was the first. It included that adjacent commercial tier. Not illegal, not absurd, just strategically misaligned with Vanguard's contract obligations. If pushed in front of a board without qualification, it would invite scrutiny. The second was the messaging framework. In early drafts, I often test language for tone flexibility. One version leaned into transparency and public engagement themes, useful in commercial sectors, risky in controlled federal environments where overcommunication can trigger compliance reviews. She used that version. The third was media allocation. The exploratory model distributed budget across digital channels, assuming broader accessibility. In reality, many federal personnel operate under usage restrictions during work hours. Targeting them through certain platforms reduces practical engagement and invites questions about audience alignment. She presented it as optimized reach. The fourth was vendor alignment. The list included one subcontractor pending updated supply chain risk documentation. It was flagged clearly in my working notes. She removed the flag. The fifth was pricing structure. Exploratory tab built to test scalability scenarios. It assumed commercial-style margin elasticity rather than standard federal cost-plus constructs. In isolation, it was an analytical tool. Presented as policy, it was unstable. The sixth was compliance mapping. Early draft crosswalk referencing, baseline D, FARS alignment, but not yet incorporating the most recent internal revisions Vanguard had adopted. That update existed in my restricted folder, not in the shared draft. The seventh was risk assessment, a broad model identifying reputational exposure and growth opportunity, but not fully integrating OPSEC considerations tied to downstream contractor messaging. Individually, none of these would collapse a company. Together presented as a cohesive strategic direction, they created imbalance. Boards don't react to single typos. They react to patterns. I didn't insert false data. I didn't fabricate violations. I left draft logic where it was and finalized the real version elsewhere. If Paige had asked to walk through the updates, we would have corrected everything together. She didn't ask. Back in the room, the segmentation slide lingered on screen. The Navy officer asked, "Are you recommending engagement beyond federally contracted channels?" Page reframed it. "We're suggesting optional expansion into adjacent sectors to future-proof positioning." Future-proofing is a comforting phrase. The chief compliance officer tapped his copy of the deck. Future-proofing is different from scope expansion. Vanguard operates under controlled program parameters. Page nodded. Of course, this would be carefully managed. Carefully managed isn't a control. The CFO flipped to the pricing section again. "Walk me through how this structure complies with federal cost accounting standards." She navigated to the pricing slide. I could see her confidence recalibrating. She believed in presentation momentum. If she kept moving, the questions would soften. They didn't. She described scalability, flexibility, margin efficiency. She didn't mention indirect rate caps. She didn't mention audit exposure. She didn't mention cost realism analysis. Because the draft she used didn't include those details yet. I didn't interrupt. My legal pad had 7 bullet points written down, each one aligned to one of the draft pressure points. Across the table, one of Vanguard's internal strategy leads whispered something to the compliance officer. A page turned. The room was no longer absorbing slides. It was verifying assumptions. That shift is subtle but decisive. When a board transitions from listening to checking, the presenter has lost control of narrative flow. Page moved to the vendor slide again to reinforce credibility. She emphasized that all partners were aligned with federal standards. The compliance officer didn't argue. He simply asked, "Do you have documentation confirming updated CMMC readiness for this vendor?" She paused for a fraction of a second. "Yes," she said. "Our internal review cleared them." The internal review she referenced was my draft note that specifically flagged pending documentation. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence, measured silence. One of the advisory panel members leaned back and folded his arms. He wasn't offended. He was evaluating. Boards don't punish boldness. They punish imprecision. Page advanced to the risk assessment slide. She described proactive brand positioning and reputational resilience. The compliance officer interjected. "Where in this model are OPSEC considerations mapped?" She scanned the slide. The draft version included reputational risk categories. It did not yet integrate operational security mapping. That existed in my finalized framework. She referenced generalized security awareness instead. It wasn't wrong. It just wasn't complete. The CFO looked down at the printed appendix again. The Navy officer closed his folder. The CEO, who had been quiet the entire time, finally spoke. Before we proceed further, he said evenly, "I'd like to understand who built this framework." Page answered immediately. "I led the strategic direction with support from our compliance liaison." Support. The word landed cleanly. I kept my hands folded on the table and met the CEO's eyes without speaking. The room wasn't tense. It was assessing alignment between ownership and understanding. And alignment is something federal boards take very seriously. I felt my phone vibrate against the inside pocket of my blazer, but I didn't look down. The CEO's question hung in the air for a second longer than most people were comfortable with. "I led the strategic direction with support from our compliance liaison," Page repeated, steady voice. "Support." The CEO shifted his gaze from her to me. "Major Shaw," he said, calm and direct. "How closely were you involved in developing this framework?" Every head at the table turned. I didn't rush to speak. In rooms like this, speed reads as defense. "I developed the initial compliance models and risk structures," I said evenly. "The materials presented are early-stage drafts." Page's posture stiffened slightly. "These are finalized," she interjected smoothly. "We aligned internally before sharing." I kept my tone neutral. "The versions shared appear to reflect exploratory scenarios we built during early modeling." Exploratory. That word mattered. The chief compliance officer leaned forward. "Exploratory in what sense?" "Scenario testing," I replied. "We built alternative models to stress test segmentation pricing and vendor exposure. The finalized compliance-aligned version is more conservative." The CFO flipped back to the pricing slide. "So this pricing structure is not the recommended model. It's one of 3 tested," I said. Page stepped in again. "It's the most forward-leaning and scalable." The CEO didn't look at her this time. He looked at the slide. "Forward-leaning is fine," he said. "Non-compliant is not." No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. The chief compliance officer opened his folder and pulled out a printed copy of the vendor slide. "Vendor 3, he said. Do you have updated documentation confirming their CMMC readiness? Paige answered before I could. Yes. The compliance officer's expression didn't change. Could you share the confirmation date? That information wasn't in the draft file. It was in my restricted folder. Paige hesitated, not dramatically, just long enough for someone trained in rooms like this to notice. I don't have the exact date in front of me, she said. But it cleared our internal review. Internal review. The CEO folded his hands. Who conducted that review? Silence again, thin but present. I spoke without raising my voice. I flagged that vendor as pending updated documentation in the draft stage. The cleared version is in the finalized compliance packet. Paige turned toward me. That wasn't resolved, she asked, as if this were new information. It was resolved, I replied. In the finalized version. The distinction was clear now. Draft versus finalized. Exploratory versus compliant. The CFO closed his binder. I think we need clarity on which version we're reviewing. The CEO nodded once. Agreed. He looked directly at me. Major Shaw. Do you have the finalized compliance-aligned framework available? I did. Not because I expected drama, because I expect verification. Yes, I said. I have it with me. Paige's jaw tightened just slightly. She hadn't anticipated that variable. The CEO didn't ask me to present immediately. He did something more controlled. Let's take 10 minutes, he said. We'll reconvene with the finalized materials. The room broke into smaller conversations as board members stood and stepped aside. Paige turned to me the moment we were out of direct earshot. What are you doing? She asked under her breath. Clarifying versions, I replied. You're undermining me. I'm clarifying versions. Her voice lowered. You could have backed me up. I looked at her steadily. I backed up the work. She held my gaze for a moment, searching for something, apology, maybe hesitation. She didn't find it. Across the room, the chief compliance officer approached me. Major, he said quietly. When you say finalized, are we talking about substantive differences? Yes, I replied. Segmentation scope tightened. Vendor certification updated. Pricing aligned with federal cost standards. Risk model integrated with OPSEC mapping. He nodded once. That's what I expected. Expected. That word carried weight. Paige rejoined the conversation as if nothing had shifted. We're aligned, she said lightly. This is just about fine-tuning. Fine-tuning implies cosmetic adjustment. This wasn't cosmetic. It was structural. When we reconvened, I connected my laptop to the screen. The finalized segmentation model appeared first. No adjacent commercial tier. Clear federal alignment. Contract-specific boundaries defined. The CEO reviewed it silently. The CFO scanned the pricing tab. Indirect rate caps reflected, he noted. Yes, I said. Aligned with federal cost accounting standards. The compliance officer flipped to the vendor page. Updated documentation attached. Yes, I said. Appendix B. He turned to it and scanned the certification confirmation. The Navy officer leaned back again, but this time with a different posture. Less evaluation. More stability. Paige remained standing at the side of the screen. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She didn't contribute. Because she couldn't. The difference between draft and finalized wasn't dramatic visually. It was discipline structurally. And discipline is easy to recognize when you've lived inside it. The CEO closed his folder. I appreciate the clarification, he said. Accuracy matters more than momentum. He turned to Paige. We'll need to understand how the exploratory versions were shared as final. The room didn't flare. It cooled. Paige started to respond, but the compliance officer spoke first. Let's not speculate here. We'll review internally. Review internally. In federal environments, that phrase is procedural, not emotional. It means logs, timelines, documentation. It means someone will check version history. It means narrative won't matter. Facts will. The meeting didn't collapse. It recalibrated. Discussion shifted to the finalized framework. Questions became technical instead of skeptical. The CFO asked about implementation timelines. The CEO asked about internal change management. I answered directly referencing the compliant models. Paige stood beside the screen, silent for the first time since we walked in. No one addressed the earlier slides again. They didn't need to. They were already archived in everyone's printed copy. And archived things don't disappear. The CEO didn't raise his voice when he asked the next question. Walk me through the decision process that led to the exploratory version being labeled as final. Paige straightened her shoulders. It wasn't labeled incorrectly, she said. We aligned internally on a forward-leaning direction, and I presented what reflected that alignment. No apology, no uncertainty, just positioning. The chief compliance officer glanced at me. Major Shaw, he said, were you aware that the exploratory segmentation and pricing models were being shared as final recommendations? I was not aware they were being shared as final, I replied. The drafts were clearly marked internally. The CFO flipped to the header of the printed slide. This version doesn't say draft, he said evenly. It didn't. Page had removed that label. The CEO looked at Page again. When did you consider the exploratory model fully vetted? She didn't hesitate. After internal discussions last week. Internal discussions. That phrase would matter later. One of Vanguard's senior advisors leaned forward. Was there documentation reflecting that shift from draft to final? That's the kind of question that separates consulting energy from federal accountability. Page glanced briefly in my direction before answering. We had working conversations. Working conversations don't create audit trails. I kept my hands flat on the table. The CEO nodded once, absorbing the answer. In this environment, he said calmly, working conversations aren't substitutes for documented validation. The room wasn't hostile. It was instructional. Page pivoted. Understood. That's why having Major Shaw's finalized framework is helpful. Helpful. Not necessary. Helpful. The compliance officer tapped the segmentation slide again. The adjacent commercial tier, he said. What was the risk mitigation plan for preventing scope bleed? Page opened her mouth. I spoke before she could overcompensate. There wasn't one, I said plainly, because it wasn't intended as a recommendation. It was included in early scenario modeling to illustrate boundary risk. The Navy advisor's expression shifted slightly. So the draft explicitly contained an element meant to demonstrate what not to do. Yes, I said. Page interjected quickly. It was framed as opportunity in our strategic discussion. The CFO leaned back. Opportunity for what? Silence again. Page began explaining long-term growth, diversified positioning, narrative flexibility. None of it addressed the core issue, scope alignment. The CEO folded his hands. Let's simplify, he said. If we had moved forward on the exploratory model without clarification, what would have been the practical consequence? That question wasn't abstract. It was risk analysis. I answered directly. Potential audit exposure, I said. Misalignment between public messaging and contract limitations. Vendor certification discrepancies flagged during compliance review. At minimum, reputational risk. At worst, contractual friction. The room stayed still. The compliance officer nodded slightly. That matches our assessment. Page looked at me, not angry, calculating. She wasn't used to losing narrative control. In family dynamics, if she pressed long enough, people softened. Boards don't soften. They document. The CEO shifted the conversation. Let's review access control for these materials. That sentence landed differently than the others. He wasn't just evaluating strategy now. He was evaluating process. Page adjusted her stance. Our internal systems allow collaboration, she said. We moved quickly to align. The compliance officer's voice remained steady. Who authorized your elevated access to the strategy directory? It came through leadership, she replied. Which leadership? She named the senior partner whose identity had been mirrored in the spoofed email. The CEO looked at me. Major Shaw. Were you aware of that authorization? No, I said. Did you approve expanded access? No. The compliance officer made a note. IT logs will clarify the approval chain. He didn't accuse. He didn't speculate. He simply stated what would happen. Page crossed her arms briefly, then relaxed them. This feels procedural, she said lightly. The real issue is strategic direction. The CEO's tone sharpened just slightly. In federal environments, process is strategic direction. That line settled over the table. Page tried one more angle. Our goal was to demonstrate bold thinking. The Navy advisor spoke for the first time in several minutes. Bold thinking is welcome, he said. Unvetted thinking is not. He looked at me. Major, your finalized model reflects contract boundaries clearly. Yes, I said. Were those boundaries communicated internally before this meeting? Yes, I replied. In written form. The CFO flipped through his printed deck again. This version doesn't reflect those boundaries. It didn't. The CEO exhaled slowly. We're not questioning intent, he said. We're questioning governance. Governance isn't glamorous. It's structure. And structure is where I live. Page's composure remained intact, but her voice lost a fraction of its earlier ease. We can reconcile versions internally, she said. We will, the CEO replied. The phrasing was deliberate. Not you will. We will. Collective oversight. The compliance officer closed his folder. From our perspective, He said we need a documented explanation of version control and access authorization before we proceed further. That wasn't anger, it was protocol. Paige nodded. Of course. The meeting shifted again, not to strategy, not to vision, but to internal governance and version history. The slides no longer mattered. The narrative no longer mattered. The question on the table was simpler now. Who controlled the work? And how? The chief compliance officer slid his notebook closer and spoke without raising his voice. Let's walk through version control step by step. There was no accusation in his tone, just structure. Paige nodded, still standing near the screen. Our team collaborates in a shared directory, she said. Drafts evolve quickly. The compliance officer turned to me. Major Shaw, who holds primary administrative control over the strategy folder. I do, I answered. Role-based permissions. Limited write access. Logged activity. He nodded once. Was expanded access requested for this engagement? Yes, I said. Temporary elevation was granted last week. Paige stepped in smoothly. To avoid bottlenecks, she added. The CFO didn't look at her. Who authorized it? She repeated the senior partner's name. The compliance officer made another note. We'll need the access request record and originating email. I had already saved both. I have the activity logs with timestamps, I said evenly. The CEO looked at me. Please share them. I connected my laptop again. No theatrics, just navigation. System activity report. Date range. User activity. 9:42 p.m. Elevated access initiated. 9:44 p.m. Segmentation draft opened. 9:47 p.m. Vendor model opened. 9:49 p.m. Pricing scenarios opened. 9:55 p.m. Bulk download. The compliance officer leaned forward slightly. Was this access within the approved scope of collaboration, he asked. It exceeded prior permissions, I replied. Temporary elevation was processed. Paige folded her arms, then relaxed them again. It was approved, she said. We needed efficiency. The CEO asked the next question carefully. Major Shaw, did you authorize that elevation? No. Were you informed before it was granted? No. Silence again. This time it wasn't analytical. It was procedural. The compliance officer turned his notebook around and wrote one word in clear letters. Verification. He looked at Paige. Did you submit the request personally? Yes, she said. Under whose authority? Under internal leadership direction. The CFO interjected. Do you have that written approval? It was an email, she replied. I opened the access request email on screen. Display name matched the senior partner. Email address did not. One character difference. The compliance officer studied it quietly. Has this address been validated internally? He asked. I confirmed with the actual partner, I said. He did not authorize expanded access. The room didn't erupt. It narrowed. Paige shifted her weight. It must have been a miscommunication, she said quickly. I spoke with him earlier that week. The CEO didn't challenge her directly. He asked something more precise. Did you verify the email origin before submitting the access request? That's the kind of question people answer differently under pressure. I trusted the communication, she said. Trust is not a control. The compliance officer closed his laptop. From our standpoint, this is not about blame, he said. It's about governance and documentation integrity. That phrase mattered. Documentation integrity. In federal contracting, integrity is literal. Version history, access control, audit logs. Emotion doesn't enter the equation. The CEO looked at both of us. Let me be clear, he said. We are not accusing anyone of malicious intent. We are assessing process breakdown. Process breakdown is a sterile term. It still ends careers. Paige tried to reclaim narrative ground. Our intent was to move decisively, she said. There was no deception. No deception. I didn't contradict her emotionally. I stayed factual. The drafts were clearly marked internally. The re-uploaded versions removed those markers. The compliance officer turned to me. Do you have metadata showing modification history? Yes. I pulled up file properties. Creation date. Original author. Modification timeline. The segmentation file showed original creation under my account draft status, embedded in version notes. The re-uploaded file showed new creation timestamp under Paige's credentials. Draft label removed. Content unchanged structurally. Just retitled. The CFO studied the screen. So the content wasn't fabricated, he said slowly. It was reclassified. That was accurate. It was early-stage modeling, I said. Not approved strategy. The Navy advisor finally spoke again. In federal work, Premature classification of draft material as final is a governance issue. Not dramatic, not loud, just factual. Paige exhaled. This feels disproportionate, she said. We're talking about iterative strategy development. The CEO's voice remained calm. We're talking about document control within a regulated environment. He folded his hands. Major Shaw, do you have documentation reflecting the finalized compliance-aligned version was completed prior to this meeting? Yes, I said. I opened the restricted folder metadata. Time-stamped. Version history intact. Compliance cross-references embedded. The compliance officer reviewed the details. This version reflects updated vendor certification, he said. Yes. And OPSEC integration. Yes. The CFO closed his binder completely. That's the version we should be reviewing. The CEO nodded. Agreed. He turned to Paige. For clarity going forward, the finalized compliance-aligned framework will serve as the official strategic baseline, not a reprimand, a designation. Paige stood still for a moment. Then she nodded. Understood. The compliance officer made one final note. We will coordinate with Ironclad's leadership to ensure version control and access protocols are tightened. That sentence was procedural. It was also decisive. The discussion moved back to implementation timelines and deliverables, but the earlier slides didn't vanish. They remained part of the printed record. And printed records don't adjust themselves retroactively. They get archived, with timestamps. The CEO didn't adjourn the meeting dramatically. He summarized next steps, assigned follow-up deliverables, and asked Ironclad to provide a documented explanation of version control and access authorization within 72 hours. 72 hours is a generous window in federal work. It's also long enough for facts to settle. On the drive back to Ironclad's office in Arlington, Paige sat in the passenger seat staring straight ahead. Neither of us turned on the radio. Traffic on Route 50 moved steadily indifferent to compliance governance and sibling dynamics. Halfway back, she finally spoke. You blindsided me in there. I kept my eyes on the road. I clarified version control. You could have backed the strategic direction. I backed the compliant direction. She exhaled sharply. You always default to rules. In federal contracting, that's not a flaw. She didn't respond. At the office, Ironclad's managing partner called an immediate internal review session. Conference room. Glass walls. No raised voices. The managing partner started with one question. Did anyone authorize expanded access to the Vanguard strategy directory? The senior partner, whose name had been mirrored, shook his head. I did not approve that request, he said plainly. IT confirmed the email discrepancy within minutes. Spoofed internal address. Slight character alteration. Processed under time pressure. Not a sophisticated cyber attack. Just enough to slip past surface review. The managing partner looked at Paige. Did you submit this request? Yes, she said. Were you aware the email was not legitimate? I believed it was, she replied. I had discussed access needs earlier that week. Discussion isn't authorization. The room stayed quiet. The managing partner turned to me. Did you escalate the access change before the board meeting? I documented it and notified my Army supervisor, I said. I did not escalate internally prior to the meeting. Why not? Because the content being presented would clarify whether exploratory drafts were being positioned as final strategy. No one challenged that logic. The managing partner nodded slowly. This is a governance issue, he said, not a personality issue. In consulting firms, that's code. It means the firm will protect client trust first. An internal audit began immediately. IT pulled access logs. Version histories were cross-referenced. Email headers were examined. There was no evidence of malicious intrusion from outside the organization. The request originated from Paige's workstation. The spoofed email was used to trigger access elevation. She maintained that she believed the authorization was valid. Intent matters in criminal law. In federal contracting, governance documentation matters more. By the end of the second day, the firm's outside counsel had been briefed. The findings were summarized in a clean internal report. Unauthorized access requests submitted. Draft materials reclassified without documented approval. Exploratory models presented as finalized strategy. No emotional language, just bullet points. Paige was placed on administrative leave pending final review. She called me that night. You went to your Army supervisor, she asked immediately. Yes. You escalated this outside the company. I documented an access irregularity involving material tied to a federal client. That's required. You made it sound bigger than it was. I described what happened. Silence on the other end. You didn't have to push this, she said. I didn't push anything. You could have fixed it internally. It was already in front of the board. She didn't argue that. Instead, she shifted. Mom knows. Of course she did. Within an hour, my phone buzzed. Our mother. I don't understand why this had to become such a big deal, she said without greeting. It's a federal contract, I replied. She made a mistake. You could have protected her. I protected the client. You're always so rigid. I'm consistent. She sighed. You know how much this job meant to her. I didn't say what I was thinking. That Vanguard's contract meant jobs to hundreds of employees. That compliance failures cost more than embarrassment. That process breakdowns don't get solved with family sympathy. 2 days later, Ironclad finalized its internal decision. Paige's employment was terminated for violation of internal access control policy and misrepresentation of draft materials as finalized strategy. The language was measured, professional, firm, no dramatic escort out of the building, no raised voices. She was given the standard separation meeting with HR and legal counsel present. Her badge was deactivated. Her company laptop was surrendered. By the end of the afternoon, her name had been removed from the Vanguard engagement roster. Leadership called me into the managing partner's office afterward. Vanguard has requested that you serve as technical lead for the engagement moving forward, he said. Understood, I replied. This will come with increased responsibility. I'm aware. He leaned back slightly. You handled yourself professionally. I nodded. No celebration. No victory speech. Just work. Later that evening, I received an email from Vanguard's Chief Compliance Officer. Appreciate your transparency and documentation. Looking forward to continued alignment. Transparency and documentation. Not brilliance. Not boldness. Just alignment. At home, my phone lit up again. Family group chat this time. My aunt asking what happened. My cousin saying Paige was misunderstood. My mother insisting that things had gotten out of hand. I typed one sentence. I did my job. Then I set the phone down. In federal environments, accountability isn't personal. It's structural. And structure doesn't bend because someone shares your last name. I showed up at Vanguard the following Monday with a revised implementation timeline and a clean chain of authority in writing. No ambiguity. No shared ownership confusion. Technical lead, Major Madison Shaw. Client-facing coordination routed through compliance first, strategy second. It wasn't glamorous. It was stable. The first working session under the new structure felt different immediately. Instead of broad language about disruption and growth, we walked through phased rollout checkpoints, contract scope boundaries, vendor revalidation milestones, pricing review gates aligned with federal cost structures. The CFO asked practical questions about burn rate. The Chief Compliance Officer requested quarterly audit readiness reviews. The CEO wanted assurance that any public-facing messaging would be pre-cleared through internal governance. Every answer came from documented models. No improvisation, no reinterpretation, just alignment. Ironclad adjusted quickly. Consultants do when contracts are at risk. The managing partner formalized stricter version control policies across all federal engagements. No draft file could be shared externally without compliance sign-off. Access elevation now required dual verification. The firm framed it as growth through accountability. That phrasing works well in board decks. In reality, it was risk containment. I didn't take satisfaction in the policy changes. I recognized them. In the Army, corrective action isn't punishment. It's prevention. Over the next 6 months, Vanguard's engagement stabilized. Vendor certifications were revalidated and documented. Messaging guidelines were narrowed to reflect contract boundaries precisely. Pricing structures were aligned with cost realism expectations and internal audit checkpoints. At the first quarterly review, the CFO opened the meeting with a simple statement: appreciate the clarity. Clarity doesn't trend on social media. It keeps contracts intact. Ironclad's leadership stayed cautious around me for a while. Not hostile, just aware. They understood that documentation isn't optional in federal spaces. Eventually, normal rhythm returned. Meetings ran cleaner. Questions were asked earlier. Draft labels stayed intact until officially removed. At Fort Belvoir, I briefed my Army supervisor on the outcome of the Vanguard review. He listened quietly and then asked one question. Any lingering exposure to your clearance? No, I replied. Documentation is complete. He nodded once. Good. That was the entire conversation. Clearance maintained. Assignment continued. At home, things were less procedural. Paige moved back in with our parents temporarily after losing the job. That information reached me through relatives, not her directly. She didn't call. She didn't text. Our mother tried twice to initiate what she called reconciliation. She made a mistake, she said again. She made several decisions, I replied. You didn't have to let it escalate. I didn't escalate it. You could have softened it. Softening documentation doesn't change timestamps. I didn't argue further. Boundaries don't require speeches. They require consistency. One Sunday afternoon, Paige did call. Her voice was controlled, not angry. You think you did the right thing, she said. I followed process, I replied. You let me walk into that room with drafts. I didn't change the files. You knew. Yes, there it was. Not an accusation of fabrication. Not a claim of sabotage. An acknowledgement that I hadn't intervened to shield her. You could have warned me, she said. I flagged the draft status in the files. That's not the same. It is in federal work. Silence settled between us. For the first time in our lives, I didn't fill it. Eventually, she spoke again. You always choose rules over people. I choose accountability over narrative. She didn't respond to that. The call ended without resolution. It didn't need one. 6 months into the engagement, Vanguard extended Ironclad's contract and added a secondary program under the same compliance structure. The CEO sent a brief email to Ironclad's leadership. Appreciate Major Shaw's disciplined approach. It reflects how we operate. Disciplined, not bold, not visionary. Disciplined. Ironclad formalized my role as Senior Federal Strategy Lead for the remainder of my assignment term. The title didn't matter as much as the authority structure behind it. Clear lines, defined ownership, documented accountability. At the next quarterly review, I sat at the front of the room instead of the second row. Not because I pushed for it, because alignment demands the person who understands the framework answer for it. No one asked about the earlier draft incident again. They didn't need to. The governance update memo remained archived in both organizations' records. It would surface during audits if needed, and it would stand. One evening after work, I walked past the empty office Paige once used at Ironclad. Her nameplate had been removed. The space had already been reassigned. Consulting firms move fast. Federal contracts move carefully. Family dynamics move unpredictably. But boundaries don't move at all once they're set. My phone buzzed with a message from Vanguard's compliance team confirming final vendor certification for the extended program. I replied with a short acknowledgement and closed my laptop. No victory music, no dramatic closure, just documentation filed, access logs clean, and authority clearly defined. In the Army, you learn that control isn't about volume. It's about structure. And once structure is in place, you don't have to raise your voice for it to hold. The truth is, this was never about humiliating my sister. It was about boundaries. When my sister stole my system access, she didn't just cross a technical line. She crossed a professional one. In federal work, documentation isn't optional. Process isn't personal. And almost compliant is the same as non-compliant. I didn't ruin her career. I didn't plant false data. I didn't fabricate anything. I let draft work stay draft work, and I let the board evaluate what was put in front of them. In military environments, and federal contracting integrity shows up in logs, timestamps, and version history, not in speeches. Family makes this harder. Because when betrayal comes from inside your own circle, people expect you to soften the edges, to protect, to cover. But accountability doesn't disappear just because someone shares your last name. In the Army, I learned that you survive on protocol. In business, you survive on documentation. In family, you survive on boundaries. And sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't loud. It's controlled. It's patient. It's letting the truth stand on its own record. If you're into family revenge stories grounded in real military and corporate environments, where strategy, discipline, and documentation matter more than drama, make sure you subscribe. There are more stories about boundaries, accountability, and what really happens when someone underestimates the quiet person in the room.